Neurodivergence. You know what? Can we skip this? NDAF. Perfect.
Hi, and welcome to NDAF, aka whatever the hell this is, a space in which neurodivergent folks and their friends can talk all things spectrumy in any messy direction they want. Our guest today is author, former animation film executive, expert child's costume maker. Seriously, the anglerfish costume she made for her oldest kid this past Halloween was amazing. An advocate for parent caregivers and individuals with disabilities, Kelley Coleman, coming to us this time only a few blocks from my house here in LA. Kelley's first book, Everything No One Tells You About Parenting a Disabled Child, Your Guide to the Essential Systems, Services, and Supports, came out earlier this year, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Folks, here's Kelley Coleman. Thank you for coming on whatever the hell this thing is.
Yes.
It's just been pretty eye-opening so far into talking to people, neurodivergence in creative spaces. So I guess to start off, where are you from? I don't think I even know this.
Yes, I grew up in a small town just outside of Columbus, Ohio.
And that launches you to Los Angeles how?
Slowly, very slowly. I went to college in Chicago. I worked in New York for a little bit after and had always kind of intended to come out to LA. And so made my way out here. And that was about 25 years ago.
And how did you begin? I mean, when we were emailing about it, we talked about in terms of being a film executive working in animation and talking about neurodivergence in those spaces. Why animation? What was your impetus into that?
I've always loved animation. I didn't have the aha moment that was my thing until I did. I had worked for a producer. I had worked for a big talent agency. I worked for another producer. And one night we were out at an event celebrating someone's film. And I found myself in a conversation with an animation director. And it was literally one of those moments where it was like the cartoon light bulb over my head. And I realized that's what I want to do. These are the movies I love the most. And a couple weeks later, a friend of mine who was working at Disney Animation called me and said, we are just starting the process of hiring someone for our department. I think you'd be great. Do you want to interview? So it was the stars aligning quite nicely, and worked at Sony Animation after that, worked for an independent animation company based in Jerusalem, and writing on my own in those spaces. So I've been really fortunate to have some cool experiences.
Is there anything, I guess, if you don't want to mention anything you worked on, but are there projects that you feel particularly proud of that you got to be a part of?
Yes, when I was at Disney, so we were developing very early versions of a lot of things that became big movies. So early versions of what became The Princess and the Frog, Frozen, Tangled, and lots of others, and worked on many different things in different capacities. I really liked that when I was there, that the Disney company wanted to make princess movies, but didn't want to keep spitting out what had been made in the past, and that very genuine recognition that female stories have moved beyond I'm going to sit alone and sing to animals until a prince comes and saves me, and how to really make that bigger and better and more compelling and more appropriate. And the enthusiasm for what became The Princess and the Frog, but the enthusiasm for having an African American Disney princess, when I was there and my department, it really felt like it was coming from a place of extreme passion, not just corporate telling us we need to sell more dolls, but the passion in the holy cow, how has this not been done before, was really exciting.
Have you been on the new ride? Have you been on the reskin Princess and the Frog ride at Disneyland yet?
I haven't been on yet, and I've been chomping at the bit to go. I'm a big Disneyland fan, so I can't wait.
Kind of tap dance into the realm of neurodivergence. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, vaguely probably around the same age, I didn't know when I was a kid, there was special ed, and it was Down syndrome, it was autism, we were just all in the same classrooms, and it was just, and gifted kids, and it was just all the same. What was your first experience with neurodivergence as you kind of remember it?
So my first experience that I recall actual neurodivergence being named wasn't until well into my adulthood, when friends who had a son and was going down a diagnostic path and was appropriately diagnosed with autism. But prior to that, in looking back, as you said, we grew up at a moment in time when there's so much that wasn't identified or talked about or even known. And looking back, many friends, and even, one of my very closest friends growing up, absolutely were neurodivergent. And I am not neurodivergent myself. And I've had this conversation with a number of friends who are. And I think looking at their profile, looking at my profile, and is it a matter of checking boxes? And because there are some boxes that they're like, oh, you are. Oh, wait, but no, you're not, because you don't check any of these other boxes. And I genuinely hope that we're evolving to a place where we're not just, here's a line and which side of the line are you on? Because we're people and people are also different, but instead looking at neurotypes and this huge variety where we're not just in one category, but where everyone has space to say, this is how my brain and my body works in so many different realms. I have 2 kids. They're both amazing. I could talk about them all day. Our older son is neurotypical and our younger son is neurodivergent in addition to having multiple other disabilities. And when he was born 11 years ago, we were really thrown into this world of having a child who does not move through the world in the way that perhaps literally anyone else. He has a genetic syndrome that is yet undiagnosed, and his autism and neurodivergence shows up in many ways for him, but also it's a co-occurring diagnosis along with many other things. So in our house and day to day, we are viewing how he operates through a lens of neurodivergence, which autism was one of the more recent diagnoses that he's gotten, and it's been very helpful for us to support him exactly as he is, and for us to be sure the team is fully supporting him in all the wonderful ways that he's himself.
Are there things that he likes in particular, like that he enjoys of movies or animation, or are there things that he really responds to? I know that I respond to things that are much more emotional, for instance, and much that I can't register like an airport thriller, but I can register a Disney musical. Does he have that experience?
He absolutely does. He loves animation, maybe because he's my kid, maybe because that's his special way his brain works. He loves comedy, and especially comedy when there are funny sounds. So if there's some archery involved, or people falling or getting hit on the head, or just any funny animal sounds and things, he just sits and belly laughs. And he would be very happy to watch the same 1 or 2 movies over and over. And quite recently, he's gotten very interested in watching different movies, which has been exciting. It's a challenge when the people in the house want to watch something other than Moana for the 8,000th time. It's a great movie and I will watch it again soon, but it's a challenge when he perseverates on the same things and the rest of us are looking for something different.
Have you seen, I forget the name of it, but there's that great documentary about autism in Disney movies where that fellow kind of realized that his emotional experience, and so he starts bringing Disney movies to different classrooms and saying, this emotional response you receive from here is this is what this means. I got a lot out of that doc, actually. Do you know what I'm speaking on?
No, I need to check this out.
I only heard of it because Disney had to approve so many different inclusions of animated clips for it. So they made the whole thing. It went to like Sundance. And then they had to approve the use of Little Mermaid, of Lion King, of Aladdin, so that kids could learn a lot more from that. Like, I find that with stage musicals also. I found that with different kinds of music. I respond to things that are very emotional because it's just easier for me to read. And that doc really kind of put it all together and showed why Disney musicals are that.
I
hell of a doc.
That. Oh, I need to check that out. It's also interesting. I'm assuming many people who are listening know this already, but in case they don't, any sort of neurodivergence, autism does not equal intellectual disability. My son has intellectual disability in addition to autism. So it has been interesting. He's a complex communicator. He communicates with gestures, some signs, some sounds, a lot of pointing. And he's in the last year or so has really taken off with a communication device, which is an iPad with a communication program. And so it's really interesting as he is getting older and more mature and more sophisticated. Just within the last year, he's been able to really name and identify emotions in himself. And he's just now starting to do that with characters he's seeing in books or in movies. And it's really exciting when you're 11-year-old for the first time. One of his friends wasn't at school and he said, "Carla, sad." I was like, "Oh, were you sad that Carla wasn't at school today?" Yes. And it was wonderful.
Is there a character that he associates his own emotions with? Is he like a Bugs Bunny? Is he a flounder? Does he associate specifically with a character?
Well, we associate him with Tigger, who is very much his personality. There's nothing that we know of at the moment that is like the specific thing he associates. I think his favorite character is the lizard in Tangled, because Pascal the lizard makes funny sounds and is brightly colored. We also like bright colors in our house.
And Pascal also doesn't, does he talk or does he emote? I think I remember. Yeah, he's a beautiful emoter of emotions.
Yes.
Back to the Hollywood side of it and working with people who are neurodivergent. This podcast is not the celluloid closet as much as I love Vito Russo. It's not as I've been looking across my own experience with Hollywood, obviously I've worked with people who are neurodivergent. Over Thanksgiving, I was reading a book on Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, and their very tempestuous relationship where Noel Coward's like, "Oh, she was a drunk." And other people are like, "Oh, she was manic depressive." And it's like, it's impossible to do these kind of informal diagnoses when the truth is she's someone who just never got the help she needed across her lifetime. And it was a very difficult experience for her in Hollywood. What I've found with successful people who I've worked with who are neurodivergent, they all seem to have partners. I'll work with a director who's a very strong producer who looks after them. I'll work with executives who are kind of paired in that way. Not as much, though. Usually it seems like the neurodivergent ones are these, I am literally not going to name names, but they're kind of filmmakers or kind of are heads of art departments. And they I had it described to me once, a very older studio exec producer created a bubble around this one director who was incredibly successful, but could not work without that kind of shepherding. And so he saw it as his job to create this bubble around this director. And he produced a number of movies for him. And they made billions of dollars. And so I think that works. There are writers who are in Paris like that. Is that something you saw in animation? Or is it not as singular?
You absolutely see that. And certainly with directors and people who are just these brilliant talents. And as you were saying, it's not even that people are identified. It's not my job to diagnose anybody. It's not my job to ask anybody, hey, have you ever been evaluated for anything? No.
Yeah.
But I love the idea of creating the bubble, because within the bubble, you are, kind of shutting out the things that are going to get in the way of the talent. And you are allowing them to expand that within their bubble and to encourage them to be more of themselves. If you are trying to get the best creative work out of anybody, but I think especially if your brain is working differently than somebody else's brain, which of course you're going to encounter that, the more that you can foster that and the more that you can recognize this person might need to work differently, to operate differently, might communicate differently. And we all kind of need to almost get over ourselves a little bit when we're in these ideas of a meeting needs to happen this way, or, at this time, art needs to be put together in this fashion. It's very easy for us to fall into those rigid things, but I've had some very productive meetings over a dartboard or a pool table, and some meetings that we know not to schedule before lunchtime because certain people are really going to be not prepared to sit in a meeting when they are hungry and ramping towards this. You absolutely see that so much in animation. And I think animation, something I love about it that's really cool is it tends to be people who are purely talented and not faking it. When you are working with so many artists, you can see it there on the page that, being in a building where people are doing things that I can't do is incredibly humbling. And I think the best executives are the ones who don't try to insert themselves into that, but who recognize I am here to support your vision and let's run with that. And yes, of course, there are notes that feedback and everything that can be productive, but it's really exciting when we don't try and insert ourselves too much and really see what can happen.
On that, during the '08 Writers Guild strike, I went to Canada and I was working in video games for a while. And I think the thing that struck me the most about completely switching industries for a while was you find kind of the edges smoothed out in Hollywood a bit. Like if there's this crazy idea, it's like, ooh, that might cost you 2 ticket sales in like wherever. With games, it was very much like, oh, that is a crazy idea that stays on the whiteboard because that's so memorable and so bizarre that in gameplay, that's what the players will actually remember. That's what they'll actually respond to. And you really had an inversion of the creative process where it wasn't so much, at least at that time, drilled down into product. It was very much like we're competing with all of these things. We have so many games in this space. We have so many things that are similar. What on earth can we do to stand out in the $40 to $50 million console market and just get things out there that people will say, oh, that's wild. And it actually was weird to go back to film where it was just kind of like, oh, it's that same description of every screenplay of it's, oh, she's 27 and she has a penetrating gaze. And here's and just the way that they want you to write a character so that the actor or actress responds to it at the agency level so they can, and you're just kind of like, it's almost photocopied in the script after script after script. And you're just like, oh, it has to be that. And it was always very frustrating. So, but that, I mean, again, there's a lot of money. So it's up to different people. So
yes, I was just having this discussion. There's a movie, I'm forgetting the name of it. There's a trailer for it that's out now in theaters. And it was based on a book that's memoir of a dad with an autistic son. And the trailer, ultimately, I have not seen the movie. I have not read the book. It might be amazing, but the trailer feels very like inspirational. And we've gotten our inspiration from having our autistic kid in a way that feels like, let's just sand off all the edges. And I think when you do that, in presenting stories of people with any disability, and I know people who are neurodivergent do not have to or always identify as disabled, but I use that term often in our lives because we deal with lots of disability. But the edges get so sanded off that there becomes this inspiration, and it becomes as though like, oh, your autistic child is here to teach you lessons about the world, and that is their purpose. And oh my goodness, no.
Thank God for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like,
I'm like, my kid's purpose some days is to watch airplanes and laugh at farts because he's an 11-year-old boy that he gets to choose.
That's been the subject of so far on this podcast, talking to people about just what happens when you can't solve a mystery for the neurotypicals so you get accepted, when you can't be Wednesday Addams and do the dance. Everybody's like, oh, okay, so there is something we, the neurotypicals, can derive from you that makes you acceptable to society.
Yes.
You're gruff, but you figured out that Moriarty is going to like poison the well or whatever. Yes. And it just drives you nuts because, I don't know. It's the only trope that's available. So...
So much so. And then you end up feeling like the goal of the story is for the character to be less disabled. Isn't this great? Ooh, yuck. Yeah. Or that character's sole purpose in life is to teach us the meaning. No, it gets really messy, I think, partly because, like you said, there's almost a formula of here's what we're spitting out again for the big movies that fall into all of the bullet points and have to wrap up neatly with a bow at the end that leave us feeling good. And also the lack of representation. You know, you look back to like when Rain Man came out and so many people were like, whoa, this autism thing. What is this? Now I know all about it. This is what autistic people are. And nope, that's one person that was a character built into a movie. And without the representation, it becomes so easy to just write off, okay, so everyone in a wheelchair does this, everyone who's blind does this, everyone who's autistic does this. And I really think the only way to combat that is having the representation in there, not just as, the very special episode teaching about the thing, but really about there are just autistic kids in the classroom. There are just kids with Down syndrome just walking around and going to the gym. The more that we see it, the more that we won't tokenize, which I hope we get there, for everyone's sake, certainly for my kids' sake.
Well, that's the thing. It also seems with side characters, you have the IT guy with like the constantly expressed traits, can't make eye contact, does all the social interaction. You never see people who are masking. And I'm like, autistic people mask. So you see these people and you're like, oh, so they just arrived on the planet and have no idea how to actually do this. And I was just having this conversation with somebody else on this about on House, when it was obvious that they were creating House with Asperger's, and the book that Bones is based on was based on autistic character. But on television, they couldn't say it. They kept having to dance back so they could get away with using pieces of savantism, using pieces of like selective mutism. They could do anything. And then there's an episode of House where they're like, I used to think you had Asperger's. Now I just know you're a jerk. And House is like, ha ha ha. And you're just like, there is nothing you can do. And it just, I don't know. That's why talking about Stephen King at some point, he did a lot of the tokenism, the kind of Lenny of Mice and Men tokenism for a very long time with Duddits and Dreamcatcher, with John Coffey in Green Mile, with Tim Cullen in The Stand. Danny in The Shining is described as, oh no, could he be autistic? And the Wendy and Jack are terrified of that as like a diagnosis. And now he has evolved and he has this Holly Gibney character who is neurodivergent, and she's written very well. And it feels like he has finally come to a stage where he is no longer writing that old tropey version of a neurodivergent character. But it took decades to get away from that. So, I mean, obviously we're talking about these monolithic Rain Mans and Curious Incidents and Dog in the Nighttime and all these big monolithic representations of neurodivergence. Have you seen a good version of neurodivergence on screen that you think, oh, that's it. That actually is something that's familiar to me and is done with nuance that you actually think people would do well to emulate?
I'm so hesitant to say that because the truth is, as a person who's not neurodivergent, I still feel like I can guess and I can feel pretty good about it. But the reality is, without that firsthand experience, I still feel like I'm kind of wading into what is right, what is appropriate, what is not. And the things where I feel like I'm seeing and like, oh, they nailed that, or oh, they messed that, is the caregiver piece. My son will always be interdependent. I will always be his caregiver. He has a lot of support needs. And I find myself, always wanting to see all the different things, educating myself, but it's the caregiver piece that I find myself, I often think about it's okay to portray the parents and the caregivers who are scared, confused, get it wrong. I first think about Avatar: The Last Airbender, and one of the characters, Toph, is blind and was blind, I believe, from birth, but certainly from very young age. And her parents totally get it wrong, and they're awful, and they are like, we must shelter you, we must not create a bubble in which you can thrive, but we must create a bubble that will crush the very being of who you are, because this is bad. And I think it's important to also show that piece so that we can have a conversation and to recognize, is that everyone? Nope, sure isn't. But those feelings can be real for some people, and that we do need to talk about that so that we can really dive into, where the tragedy lies. The tragedy is not my child who is disabled. It's not disability itself. It's, man, there's so much ignorance, including my own, that I will be working on for forever, and just all of these barriers and things. And the more that we can, again, have the representation, the more I feel like we can really chip away at that. Because I think pop culture is often people's first entry point into any person, type of person, group of people who are different than they are. And it's exciting when, you have Will and Grace showing gay characters who are just people being out in the world. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, okay, cool, great. when that wasn't what they had known in their previous life experience. And I think for any group of people that hasn't been represented well or at all or very little, it's exciting.
Funny, because as much flack as Kirsten's in The Dog in the Nighttime gets for saying it was written by a non-neurodivergent writer who borrowed some first-person essays and wrote this thing and was like, it's okay for a father to say this kid's mom died instead of ran off because it's hard having an autistic child. So many people read that book and got diagnosed. So many people read that book and were like, oh, wait, that's me. And so there's yes, it is a deeply problematic book, yet the good it has done for people who recognized aspect of Chris's journey in that book to be like, oh, wait, that halting kind of thought pattern, that inability to introduce themselves into social interactions with strangers, that kind of OCD about walking in and walking out of situations really affected a lot of readers in ways that were very, very positive. Yet it's a book that says it's okay to emotionally abuse people who are neurodivergent because why wouldn't you? Because they're lesser than. So it's representation. It's not black or white sometimes. It's not all. I always use the example of The Remains of the Day. For me, that was the movie I saw where I was like, oh, that's me. And it was that need for routines, that avoidance of social interaction, that understanding of every bit of order that you can just build into your life so that there is no change. And when Ishiguro talked about writing a book in those terms, and when Anthony Hopkins came out and talked about his own diagnosis, and you're kind of looking at the movie like that, you're like, oh, that's what people should be pointing at, not Rain Man. That is one of the best examples of neurodivergence that's ever been on film. And yet they never mention neurodivergence. They never talk about autism. They just show someone who needs these rigid routines and has this and understands the social hierarchy in which they're allowed to live and thrive within it. And it's interesting that Ishiguro has returned to that theme a number of times in his novels, most recently with Clara and the Sun, and just looks at hierarchies over and over and over again in those terms. And it's like, that's the great representation. But it's not as monolithic as a Rain Man or a Forrest Gump or any of those kinds of things. So or a House or a Big Bang Theory or whatever.
Yes. And even as you're saying all of these things, I have a number of friends who are women who were not diagnosed until well into their adulthood. And so much of what we are seeing are representations of men.
Oh, yeah.
And so often it is valuable for everyone to see these and for women as well to say, oh, I've actually been masking for so long, I might not have even realized that's what I'm doing and why I'm so exhausted and need to unplug at the end of my days. That I would love to see more women being represented. And it is that challenge, as you said, because you don't want to veer into the yucky territory of, I'm an autistic woman, therefore I'm doing these things. And which is why we need more autistic women creators and directors and showrunners who are comfortable really inserting a perspective that I think we have not seen enough. And I think that people want to see. And I've talked to a number of friends very recently who've said, oh, I didn't even realize that X and Y and Z that are going through my head, that's not what's going through everyone else's head in this interaction, and has been really eye-opening to just hear other people's stories.
Good stuff. I remember so many times I go for general meetings as a screenwriter and I'd walk out and I'd be like, that was amazing. That was the greatest meeting ever. And then my manager would call like an hour later and be like, are you having an off day? Were you sick? Were you? And I'm like, no, it's great. I was like on fire. We had this great conversation. You'd be like, really? Because they thought you were like really kind of, that you didn't want to be there, that you were kind of down a level. I was like, we talked about like making like 100 things together. And they're like, oh, yeah, really? I'm like, over and over and over, like you'd write something and you get in the door. And then my experience of the social interaction was completely different from theirs. And so I was much more successful and was like, here's the script, never talk to me again. And that's why it's easier as an author. It's interesting what you said about women. There's so many women in genre fiction that are writing about their autistic experiences. And Shannon McGuire wrote this book, the Wayward Children series, and it's about Dorothy back from Oz, Alice back from Wonderland, Persephone back from the underworld. And like, they were in these fantasy worlds where they were unmasked, and it was great. And then they're kicked back into the real world, and their parents don't know what to do with them. And it's these deeply tragic books about and they have to go to like a special school because they got to live unmasked for a while. And what McGuire postulates in the book is that boys are noisy. And so they get noticed, they get identified. When a girl is quiet, that's just the norm. And so she makes all these great points in the Wayward Children series about why boys have so often gotten diagnosed early, whereas girls just don't. And there are books from the 40s about that, where it's just like, they used to think autism was something that was only part of the privileged classes. Well, there's a reason for that only the children of the wealthy were. It goes back to the fridge thing of, if only they had distant, cold parents. That led to autism. And it just feels that we're just getting to the point where diagnoses, that there even seems to be a criteria that kind of worked for, at least in certain countries, to even diagnose children across gender lines. I think that I think that's why I do this podcast, because I don't think anybody's quite there yet with the criteria for older ones. So.
No, absolutely. And interesting that you mentioned going into meetings for interviews and the same conversation as kids in school with teachers, because it's interesting of who is expected to do what in what situation. And I think for many of us who are not neurodivergent, the expectation is the quote unquote right thing to do is to communicate and socialize and hold a meeting like I do, because that is the way. And I think that is so harmful, frankly, for all of us. And, whether it is I am bringing a writer in and hearing a pitch or hiring someone for a project, what am I bringing them in to do? To have lunch and go out and have fun every Tuesday, or to deliver great work on this project? What are we actually screening for in these interviews? In school, what are we actually empowering kids to do? Like you said, oftentimes with girls, it's to be quiet and to be sweet and to be small. And I know so many friends' children who have gotten missed for years, or the parents have brought things up and the teacher's like, oh no, she's such a sweet kid. She's such a pleasure to have in class. But the reality is she's terrified to raise her hand, to speak up, to be a part of the group in all of these different ways. And I think there needs to be a huge shift in, who we are expecting to do what and behave a certain way. I think often school can be raising us to be employees rather than raising us to be the biggest, most creative, most interesting version of ourselves. I get it. You got a lot of kids to move through there. We've fortunately had overwhelmingly great experiences with our kids' education. But what are we working on? Are we working on like squeezing any sort of divergence out of any kid? Or are we working on figuring out who they are and how to make the most of that?
It's interesting because I contrast my experience. I got kicked out of junior high by the school for a while because I was out of control. I was a sixth grader. And they were like, he can't come back until he's got some kind of psychiatric evaluation, because I didn't fit special ed, because I was like testing very high. They're like, oh, so clearly he is not neurodivergent, clearly he doesn't need this kind of educational program because he gets all A's and gets all these tests, but there are emotional problems here. And all the different shrinks just taught me how to mask. They were just like, did you talk to somebody new every day this week? And I'd be like, I sure did. And I just make up people. I just make up characters. And they move me from one to another until I became very, very good at telling them exactly what I needed to say in order to go right back to school. And with Noah, very early on, their behaviors, Noah would say like, oh, that's very unusual. I'd be like, oh no, that's just this. And she'd be like, okay. And then Noah would do something else in elementary school or in junior high. I'd be like, oh, that's not, they're not reacting to this. They're reacting to this and this. This is why. And Noah was like, wait a minute. There's something going on here. And we began the process of getting diagnosed several years ago. And I hadn't been diagnosed at that point. And it was we were very lucky because the schools hadn't. It was just another this insanely intelligent person that the schools are like, oh, they're fine. But it's just rage and being upset and not being able to know what to do to handle all this when routines changed or interactions were made difficult. And suddenly a few great therapists later, it was like, oh, okay, so that solved a lot of questions. It solved a lot of things that were not available when I was a kid. And, has a much easier time of it and is surrounded by people who are also autistic. And it just, I hate to say, enriches their lives to be surrounded by people who speak the same language, but it absolutely does. So, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when we were looking at schools for our younger son, it was really important for him he splits his days between a special education classroom and a general education classroom. That is what is appropriate and best for him. At our homeschool, which we loved and is a great place, he would have been literally the only child with a visible disability. And we wanted him, like you said, in a group of people who are speaking his language metaphorically or literally, they get each other and they're not just the weird kid. It's just Tuesday and this is just my friend. Yeah. And I think for any of us, being with people who are like us, being with people who are unlike us is healthy. And I think so often when we talk about inclusion, we forget other disabled or neurodivergent people being there. You can't just pop my kid in and say okay, we've done that. We've done inclusion. It really does mean everybody. And it can be tricky, whether it is on a film set or in an office or in your stories, screenplays, schools. Neurodivergence or disability isn't always visible. And my son, whose disabilities are visible, gets awarded a lot of grace in the world because you're not going to be mean to him for doing his things and flapping and stimming and squealing and cheering for the lettuce at Trader Joe's, because you can look at him and safely assume he's disabled. And you'd have to be a real jerk to be like, don't you cheer for that lettuce. When we are out with other friends' kids, and again, for me, I'm a parent, so it all comes through the kid lens. When the disability or the neurodivergence isn't immediately visible, the looks and the things people say and the expectation that because you look a certain way, you need to behave a certain way. I wish everybody could just have to take a class in order to be a person or be a grown up where it's not everybody's like you and they don't have to be, and that's okay. And it is tricky, I think, when you're balancing those different things and when, your experience is a great example of, teacher society, the environment, not knowing what to do with a kid who is academically successful, but isn't able to be crammed into the same box as everyone else.
That's what's funny about stimming, going from a visible to an invisible disorder. For a long time, I was I know my stims and I know how to hide them. I'm so good at it. And then you realize there's 4 other ones that you don't realize you're very, very terrible at hiding. It's the exact same. It's constantly no, you'll never actually see me stim. You'll never. And then they'll get just a little and they'll crack their neck. And I'm like, we'll never see it. It's like dealing with people who think they're the greatest poker player in the world. And it's no, you still have 3 or 4 tells that you have no idea are your tells. And it actually has brought us the absurdity of autism, I think, has brought and I pretty close because something just ridiculous that happens and you're just that's the most embarrassing thing in the universe, makes for good conversation, which is why I think grouping people together, even on this, whatever this podcast is, talking to people about their most horrific, embarrassing situations of social interactions, or just trying to exist on the planet while autistic, is very fun, enlightening, ridiculous, and hopefully at the end of the day, creating some level of empathy. So,
yeah, and it's just the human experience of knowing that you are validated in your experience and I'm not the only one who has done this thing or had this degree of embarrassment or joy or sadness or whatever the thing is. You know, we should all be so lucky to connect with people that we can talk to about our experiences as we actually experience them.
Or the frustration of not being the girl with the dragon tattoo. I would love to have that hacker mentality, be able to put all that stuff together, drive that cool motorcycle down the Swedish freeway, like all those great things in that very heavily autistic coded character. But I'm not a superhero. I'm just this like dad in the valley. And it's and I can't solve a crossword to save my life. So if you don't talk to other autistic people and your only autistic representation are all these versions of these super detectives, you can absolutely feel like you're on the outside of things. So it's good to be around everybody else.
Yes. So. And the superhero thing is one that gets to me. And I certainly get a lot of pushback from parents saying, but my kid's a superhero because of their autism, because of their genetic syndrome, because of their limb difference, of like whatever the thing is. Yeah. I just like, that's a lot of pressure to put on somebody. If my kid wants to grow up and do all the things and like, yes, like do these things, but also being a person in the world, being a dad in the valley, being a mom who may or may not shower today. That's me. Just being regular people going through a human experience is enough. Period. And I think when we have an expectation that someone whose brain or body works differently than ours is a superhero, I get what you're going for, but I think ultimately it's not real. And
it's a fetish.
It is. Yes, thank you. And it also doesn't give ourselves or certainly our kids room to be human, to fail, to get it wrong, to say, you know, if my kid says, you know what, my epilepsy stinks and I really wish I didn't have it. And I'm like, but it makes you a superhero. It's so invalidating to his experience. Yeah. He's not yet able to communicate something that complex, but I'm guessing he would say my epilepsy stinks and I wish I never had seizures. And I'm not going to tell him that makes him a superhero because, you know, he has a seizure sometimes. So no.
The weird thing is, as you're saying that though, I'm like, I do actually have an autism related superpower. It's amazing that my whole family just rolls their eyes about. There's no such thing as having anything lost in this house.
Oh.
Because the way I see things, I take like a photo in my brain every day of every room, and it's topography. It's why I've never been lost in any city, any forest, anywhere I go. And so like, where is this hairbrush? And I'm like, it's over here. And I just find it under a stack of papers. Where's this sheet of homework? It's on your bed under this thing. And so I can go do it. And it looks like some kind of superpower. But it really is just this banal thing of some people with autism are able to just have that weird photographic, like topographical memory, and it just looks like it. So there are people that I will absolutely say it's a trope that comes from real life, but it's the dopiest trope in the world. But like, we'll never lose her homework in this house. We'll never lose a project. We'll never lose his tuba mouthpiece because I'm always like, it's here or there. And I'm always right.
By the way, our boys play the tuba in band together. And if you could come over and help us find the tuba mouthpiece sometime would be really
really?
Helpful. Yeah.
They shouldn't be in black cases. They should be in these bright yellow or green neon cases.
Yes.
So
that
would solve it all.
Yes.
Yeah.
And out of curiosity, do you recall being able to do that or just automatically doing that even back into childhood?
My whole life. Like the first time I went to like Tokyo or something, I walked it with a friend, didn't go on the subway, walked it with a friend, and I'm like, okay, so I know all the neighborhoods now. I know you could drop me at like Harajuku Station today. And I'd be able to like get to the Meiji Shrine. I'd be able to like, and this happens all the time. Like Neural is like, oh, we haven't been to the city in 10 years. And we're like, oh, that restaurant you want to go to, it's 3 blocks over there. It's 2 blocks over there. It's up the staircase. It's to the left. And it's a version, I guess, of photographic memory, but just Google Maps completely makes it in like, you don't actually need it. But yeah, you can drop me anywhere I've ever been. And I always remember where everything is. And Lauren is very amused. She probably wishes there were more effective superpowers going on here, but that is that is autism related. And it took a long time to understand that is and I've met a couple of other people with that kind of autism, of the inability. It's just like an inability to get lost.
Mm-hmm.
And it all just means you kind of always know the outline of like a cityscape. You always kind of know the outline of a room. It's very weird, but it's also awesome. So
awesome. Well, and I would imagine very comforting. I have the opposite of that. I tend to get lost entirely too often and lose my car in parking lots and things, despite great efforts. And I think like, wow, that'd be really comforting to always be certain of where my car is.
Never lose the car. Like Dodger Stadium, SoFi. I'm like, oh, you go through this exit. It's over there. It's right here. We're 3 rows in. We're 2 rows over. There it is. Mm-hmm. Like I'm like a homing pigeon with dumb stuff. And it always works. So
I love that.
I guess kind of as a last question, you're starting out in animation, Hollywood, and you are coming from, I guess it's a twofold question, a neurodivergent perspective or a neurotypical perspective. How do you make room for the other side? What would you say? How would you make room for your opposite? How would I communicate to you, hi, I think differently, but I really have this great idea for this Princess and the Frog movie. It's going to be amazing. There's going to be this alligator. It's going to blow your mind, but I need certain things in producing this. I'm not going to write a screenplay and I'm going to do storyboards. Like I'm going to approach this in a different way. How can you make space for neurodivergence in Hollywood? And I'm asking you to solve it right now.
Yes, done. I wish I had that superpower. So number one, you need to think about your own comfort level and what makes you feel comfortable and safe. Ideally, we would all be able to start off conversations by saying, hey, here's where I'm coming from. Here's what I need to be successful. We're good? Cool. The reality is, I think we can't force a comfort level that isn't there. So to the extent that you're able, really know and think about what you are comfortable sharing, how you are comfortable sharing it, and even in small ways of saying, you know what? I work better or my brain works better on Zoom than in person. Hey, rather than getting on the phone, can we email? I process words on my computer screen better than I'm processing the conversation, and I want to give you my full attention. Sometimes, and I say this is a neurotypical, sometimes you have to handhold the neurotypicals because they're just not going to get it because we haven't been expected to get it. And I think ideally we need that expectation to change for those who are neurotypical and who are saying, hey, I want to make space, but to my knowledge, I don't have friends who are neurodivergent. By the way, you absolutely do. Statistically, yes, you do. Learn about neurodivergence, learn about disability from people with the firsthand experience. And we're at a moment in time when the cheapest, easiest way to do that is look at who you are following in your social media feeds. There are so many content creators who are speaking about their experience, who are sharing videos of their experience, sharing stories of their experience. Make a point to educate yourself. Know that it is not your job to diagnose anyone, but when you are seeing individuals that you are interacting with, it might be your boss, it might be an artist or a writer or a creator you are working with, that your mind is saying, oh, I recognize that this might be neurodivergence. So I might need to ask questions, not, hey, are you autistic or what? Nope. Not ever the thing to do. That's actually none of your business unless someone else wants to share that. But the thing to do could be, hey, here's how I'm planning on running this meeting. Is there something that you need in that meeting that would make this more successful for you? When you are coming to people and saying, hey, I want this to be as successful for you as possible. Here's what I'm thinking. What feedback do you have to make that better? Being open to feedback is so important, and to really take that to heart. I've been in meetings where people have said, you are talking way too fast. Can you slow down? Can you repeat what you just said? And if my answer was nope, Or if my answer is sure, I can do that for about 12 seconds. And then I'm just going to keep powering through. That's not the right answer because the goal should always be to bring out the best in one another. And if we are all approaching it with an idea of how we are the most successful and wanting to make other people their most successful, that's when the magic happens.
That's a really fantastic response. So I appreciate it. It's funny because that sparked a very odd memory of someone who's in a generation older than us, Oscar-winning filmmaker. I was in a meeting with him once, and I remember he was talking very passionately about this project and this history. And somebody said, "Oh, and we have this production designer we're working with." And he lowered his head and he put on a voice. He was like, "No, I don't want that." And I was sitting there like, what the hell just happened? And he started shaking his head and he started like doing this thing. And everybody was like, okay. And then another person said something and he went into this voice and he did this thing. And at the time I was like, am I the only one in this room that is seeing this? Am I the only person that is having the experience that I'm having with this person? And it was clear that they had that this was just understood, that this was just how these things are going to go. And so I'm sometimes think that people's experience of neurodivergence, sometimes people's experience of autism is colored by extreme examples, by people who have been so hyper successful that they're forgiven things that are written off as drug abuse or eccentricity. And that very mild versions of things, it's like, oh, that guy's just an asshole, or that girl's just an asshole.
Yes.
Or especially where it's people who are like, oh, she's just horrible. And you're like, you suddenly really have to unpack who is telling the story.
Yes.
And is this neurodivergence? Is this somebody who's just awful and telling horrible stories? And you never know. And it just really, I think the next couple of generations are going to have a lot easier time of things as there's not only extreme examples out there. And if they have more experience, especially as you say with social media, then again, those are the people who can do social media. There's so many people in the neurodivergent world that the idea of social media becomes an obsession. Like every time I get 100 followers on anything, I delete. I'm like, I can't. And I've deleted, and Ken can speak to this. I had a book come out and the UK publishers told me, you need to post every 3 days on this Instagram thing. It doesn't matter what it is. You just have to do it. So I started taking pictures of public art and I published over 2,000 images, Dublin, New York, here, Hawaii, like all over the world of examples of public art. And they were like, that's not at all what we meant. I'm like, yes, but that is what you said.
Yes.
And that just, you can't, it doesn't always exhibit itself in the way that people want it to. So I don't know.
When, as a neurotypical person, if I am getting a reaction or having a conversation or in an interaction with someone and it's not, quote unquote, going the way I want it to or I think it should, if I'm coming from a place of genuine curiosity about the other person without saying out loud, even if I think through my head, can I view this through a lens of neurodivergence? Then that might, kick in the curiosity, kick in the empathy for me to say, oh, my way is not necessarily the right way. This is just a different way of doing things. And I think so often we're taught to say the different way is wrong, but it's not wrong. And I think ideally empowering people to not apologize when they are not doing anything wrong. If that filmmaker were to say, oh, I'm so sorry, I did this voice and I had this reaction, I did all this, I'm so sorry. Is there anything wrong with him doing that? I'm assuming it was a him doing that. Nope, nothing wrong with that at all. Is there anything wrong with stimming during a meeting or at the grocery store? Nope, nothing wrong. And we need to stop expecting people to apologize for being themselves. And we need to be people having a person experience in the world.
It's funny because some of my favorite neurodivergent filmmakers are the ones who probably don't know or haven't had formal diagnoses, but know that it's affected their personality in a certain way. And so have found very interesting ways to mask that doesn't hide it. That doesn't that they know they want to let people know, and they want people to understand that there's this thing going on, but they don't want to impose. They don't want to be the one. They're not going to apologize, but they do want to make things as kind of even keel for everybody as possible. And I've worked with people like that, and you're like, oh, okay, I wish that I could emulate that in some way. I wish I could have known this person when I was young enough to build a kind of mask or a kind of personality in that direction also. So.
And would you say that that is healthy and a good thing for those people? Or would you say it is problematic because they're masking?
There's one person I'm thinking of in particular who needs a rigid routine and would get mentally exhausted, but would wear the same thing every day and was able to talk about it in that way of, oh no, he had like a reason. Like, oh, I'm being like this filmmaker. No, we know why you're doing it. And had a very strong but very laid back producer who would notice when he got mentally exhausted, notice that he could go for 9 hours straight, but then had to physically be moved away and brought to his office, would know that if he hadn't shaved, that was an issue, that there were all these little things. So he was able to flourish with the guardrails of this extremely laid back producer who would just kind of look after him. And it was amazing to watch him flourish and allow himself to be himself. And not just professionally, but also personally, because he knew he had somebody there who wasn't reining him in or anything, but just was, I'm not going to get it right. I'm not going to be able to say it right, but just was there to be a good companion, was there to make sure things never kind of got off the rails. And they'd been working together for decades since they were kids.
That's
and it was
amazing.
wild to see how they flourished in that relationship.
And it sounds like the producer who was being supportive just had an acute awareness of what accommodations needed to be in place. And accommodations are not extra. They are access. They're necessary. They're, protected by law. And that's what we need to find the people and the spaces that can accommodate for us to flourish.
I mean, there were examples of elaborate half-hour-long dumb show that this filmmaker would go through, that the producer would be like the butt of the most elaborate joke you've ever seen. And he would sit there and just know what was happening. This guy was putting on a show because he needed to put on a show. And the producer would just sit there. And at the end, the look of marvel of the others of us sitting there after he pulls off this ridiculous magic trick over nothing. And it was because he used the producer to do this, and it made him feel strong, and it made him feel good. It made him feel like he was entertaining people, and it was fantastic. And it was a great working experience. And there's a reason this guy has flourished for so long. And I think a lot of it is knowing how he can have people in his life that allow for that space. It's not the same as the bubble guy. But it was great to see that. And I love partnerships like that when I meet people like that. And I see it a lot with screenwriting teams, and you're just like, okay, so there are two people working in tandem, and it's been like, oh, that's why it's successful. And then when those teams split up, I'm always like, I'm not surprised when somebody falters or somebody is allowed to suddenly do whatever they want.
Yes.
So thank you for being on. I mean, we're calling this NDAF because autism is so often defined by other people. And the first time I ever had autism defined to me was by an anti-vaxxer telling me that he watched his son become autistic while getting a vaccine. And I was like, wow, that sounds awful. I'm like 20. And I'm like, wow, so that's what autism is, huh? And I just kind of trundle on with my life thinking that's what it is. So this is just a space where we can messily talk about whatever the hell related to neurodivergence. So I appreciate it.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate you making this space and, for having me. I think, For many of us, this is a journey. And if we are trying to do this without firsthand experience from individuals who are having that experience, like, oh my gosh, we are just going to fail. So I thank you so much for having these conversations and for doing this. And
that was Kelley Coleman. You can learn more about her work and her numerous workshops and events at her website, kelleycoleman.com. That's Kelley, Coleman.com. You can also follow her on Instagram. Her handle is Hello Kelley Coleman, no spaces or hyphens, all one word. On a personal note, again, I can't recommend her book highly enough and only wish I'd read it a little earlier on my family's own journey through neurodivergence. It's available anywhere books can be bought. A last note, the movie I couldn't remember the title of is Roger Ross Williams' 2016 Academy Award nominated documentary, Life Animated. It's based on Ron Suskind's book, Life Animated, a story of sidekicks, heroes, and autism, and is about his son, Owen. I actually learned a lot from this doc and totally recommend it as well. You can follow our show at NDAF Show on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky. We hope you'll join us on the next episode for another conversation about all things neurodivergent. NDAF. NDAF is produced by Ken Plume, and our theme song is by Mike Furman.